What if I told you that there might be a handful of billionaires on a mission to turn the future youth of America into, well, dummies? You might think that that's a conspiracy theory, obviously. I thought so too. And then I started researching it a little bit. The more I started researching this, the more I started to wonder, is this not only not a conspiracy, but actually taking place right now in plain sight, all in the name of God? The first thing I want to say about this conspiracy theory is that everything I say in this video is my opinion. I am not stating any type of fact for legal reasons. But in order for this to be a first-grade conspiracy theory, we need a couple really important elements. First of all, we need some bad faith actors. Next, we need some moral mission. And third, we need the active plan happening right under our noses. So let's put forth some facts, see if we can read in between the lines, and you can decide for yourself whether this is a bona fide conspiracy theory or maybe even has some truth to it. Let's get into it. All right, so let's start by meeting our billionaires. First, we have here Ferris Wilks and Tim Dunn. These are Texas oil billionaires. They're also either current or former pastors. I bet you are shocked to hear that. According to this article, these two have quietly built a powerful political machine in Texas, but their vision might actually be a whole lot bigger. Their initial goal seemed to be weeding out of the Republican Party what they called rhinos, i.e., if a candidate isn't going to vote the way I think they should vote, they've probably long since been gone from the Republican Party in the state of Texas, allegedly. These men have built a network of think tanks, media organizations, political action committees, and nonprofits that work in lockstep to purge the legislature of Republicans whose vote they cannot rely on. Then there's Jeff Yass, whose net worth eclipses our first two characters. He is worth an estimated $56 billion, which almost doubled just within the past year. He is the richest man in the state of Pennsylvania, and he's also the single largest donor to the Texas governor, Greg Abbott. He also just happens to have a very specific political goal that may or may not have a direct link to a Christian nationalist agenda behind it. But regardless of its intention, it certainly leaves the door wide open to the folks who clearly do have a Christian nationalist agenda. So we can clearly see, allegedly, that all three of these guys are buying political agency within the state of Texas and maybe even beyond. But what really is their goal? Okay, in order to set the stage for the goal I think these men might have in their political agenda, I want to give a historical context for the ways in which the people in power in the evangelical community have used modern-day situations to manipulate and sway their followers' political stances, starting all the way back in 1925 with the Scopes trial. In 1925, fundamentalists who had political pull made it illegal to teach evolution in schools. John Scopes decided to be the guinea pig to test out the constitutionality of this law and ended up on trial being prosecuted by a Christian fundamentalist. This was the first ever trial of the century in America. This trial laid the groundwork for fundamentalists who soon after morphed into evangelicals to create this ideology that mixed religion, science, and education. After all, this trial was all about using the Constitution to push their religious agenda to teach evolution in schools because it contradicted the literal interpretation of the Bible. They couldn't accept any institution that would promote such a thing, and now they were going to organize against them. This trial could be seen as the start of the culture wars all the way back 100 years ago. Then we had a different flavor of the intersection between religion, politics, and education, which was the moral majority in the 60s, 70s, and 80s mostly. This movement was primarily started to resist desegregation in schools. It then later culminated in rhetoric that what was being taught in schools was evil and secular and against God. It still included evolution, but added to it. These breadcrumbs lead us all the way to today, where there are numerous culture wars happening in our public school system that intersect religion, politics, and education. Everything from wanting books to be banned, to pronouns, to determining whether sex ed is being taught. The evangelical agenda has just spread and spread and spread, particularly for how education should be viewed. For the past 100 years, evangelicals have been fed a consistent diet of doubting the public school system and wanting to dismantle it. They might call it sheltering their kids from evil influences, but I would call it something else. I might call it a common cult tactic. Now, I want to be fair and say that not every evangelical do I think is cult-brained, but we can't really deny this fact because cults thrive by defining the flow of information to its members. That's one of their tactics for retaining control. Have you ever wondered how evangelicals can be so intensely aligned on certain topics? I believe this effect doesn't come naturally. I think it's because of the concerted efforts to control the ways in which they're receiving information. And for the institutions whose information they can't control, they sow doubt of those institutions, they sow fear over the type of information coming from them, they sow outrage about what might be included in that information so that their members will reject that information. But despite their best efforts, over the past 100 years, evangelicals have not been able to retain control over what children learn in school, primarily because of the separation between church and state. But what if all of that could actually change? Remember those Texas billionaires I started out talking about? Well, one of them is Ferris Wilks, and beyond being compared to a Russian oligarch who determines which politicians are allowed to be in office, allegedly, he is also one of the largest donors of two of the main right-wing media outlets, The Daily Wire and PragerU. The Daily Wire is a network of shows you've probably heard of, like Ben Shapiro and Michael Knowles, and Jordan Peterson recently joined their group. And they target a somewhat sophisticated, educated, older group of people with misinformation, confusing information, outright lies at times, in a propaganda machine directed to those individuals. Then there's PragerU. They create quote-unquote educational content with a clear Christian nationalist agenda that they don't even try to hide. They're geared toward less educated, less sophisticated adult audiences through explainer videos, but also children. And in case you haven't heard this yet, they're no longer just an online outlet. They have contracts with schools in as many as 6 or 7 different states, at least at this point. Here's the map of the states that they're currently collaborating with to provide children's classroom curriculum materials. They've also recently collaborated with the White House to produce educational content about the Founding Fathers and the overall narrative of the founding of America. Gee, I wonder what information they might omit from that, in anticipation of the 250th anniversary of the founding of America next summer. So, agenda number 1 seems pretty clear. Allegedly, buy off politicians so that you can get votes to get Christian nationalist propaganda into public schools. But what if I told you that's just a warm-up to agenda number 2, which is a much scarier agenda for the Christian nationalist movement and might actually be underway right now? Remember Jeff Yass? Remember how I told you he has a very specific political goal? Yeah. What if I told you that his goal is to see public schools fail in favor of what he calls school choice? And it might sound like I'm exaggerating about this idea that he wants public schools to fail. Even if you have school choice, which I'll explain what that means in a second, wouldn't you still have public schools as one of those choices? Well, he actually says that this is his hope and something he thinks would be a good thing for our country in an interview that he gave on the topic. So what is school choice? Well, Yass's vision is for the kids of the future to be able to choose which school is going to best educate them. And he believes in this because he thinks that public schools are failing our kids, which is something I agree with. And so he wants to have this competitive marketplace of public schools, private schools, and charter schools, where instead of the government allocating money per kid only to public schools, the kid would be able to take that money and choose which school that money goes toward, making public schools have to be competitive in value in what they offer to a kid compared to a charter school or a private school, which sounds great, right? In theory, yes. In the interview that I read where Yass gives his reasoning for funding this advocacy, he doesn't mention anything having to do with Christian beliefs or anything like that. So it's unclear as to whether he knows about the Christian nationalist agenda and is secretly working with it, or it just happens to coincide. But let me explain exactly how the voucher system could be particularly helpful for the Ferris Wilks and the Tim Dunns of the world to push forward the next layer of their agenda. Like I mentioned, evangelicals have been wanting to control what is and is not allowed in public schools for a long time, but they continue to be stopped at the point where what they want done in schools violates the separation of church and state. Well, if a kid can take that government money from a public school and apply it to a private school, that problem goes away. Private schools can discriminate. They can discriminate on who they let in and what they teach. So just think about how many people today in the US would want to take advantage of this system where they could take their money from the government-funded school and apply it to a Christian nationalist propaganda school. Unfortunately, the answer is a lot of people. So now think about 20 years down the road when a whole generation of kids has been educated in that school system, where they can get the Christian nationalist propaganda education for free, government funded. We're looking at a whole generation of kids who are not just being indoctrinated at church and at home, but are now also being indoctrinated while also not receiving any information to contradict that indoctrination every single day at school, funded by the government and billionaires who might just believe that U.S. citizens will be infinitely more malleable under such circumstances. Maybe. Decide for yourself if you believe this one, and just remember to stay curious.